Recording is now in session. All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. This is the QFEC VFIN Field Education Professional Development Series. We're talking about human rights today. So my name is Frankie. I'm sure most of you are familiar with me by now. I am the Field Education Academic Coordinator at ACAP and a representative of the Combined Universities Field Education Group, QFEC. We also have Danielle Palos here, who's an ACAP student representative who will be supporting the session today. Before we commence, I would like to hand over to Danielle to do an acknowledgement of country, please.
Sure. Give me.
Sorry, you're on mute.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know what's going on. Yeah. We would like to acknowledge the traditional custodian of country throughout Australia and their continued connection to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to elder past, present, and emerging, and extend the respect to all Aboriginal Torres Strait Island people today. There is a chat in the chat function, and I encourage you to acknowledge to the land that you are on. And I'm grateful to be on the Gadigal land. Thank you, Frankie.
Thank you, Danielle. I am also grateful to be on Darug land. And while you guys are typing, just a little bit more information on housekeeping. So today the session is recorded, and if you don't want to appear on screen, please feel free to turn your camera off. We would definitely prefer to see your faces if you are comfortable with that. And please make sure that you're staying on mute when others are speaking. And the session is recorded, so the materials and the recording will be distributed through email after the session. So I'm sure everyone would know this. This session counts towards your placement hours, so we will be taking random attendances throughout the session. So please make sure that you're staying for the full session and making the most of it. All right, that's all for housekeeping, and I will hand over to our lovely Voices of Influence Australia team to introduce themselves and to walk us through the structure of this session today. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Alice.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Frankie, for that warm welcome. Hello, everyone. My name is Alice, and I'm the founding director of Voices of Influence Australia. And we are joined here today with a few of our team members who are fantastic and knowledgeable, and I'm sure you will gain a lot of insight from our conversations today. A bit of background about myself. So I am a recent social work graduate. I graduated in March this year. And throughout my professional development and career so far, I've dabbled in a few different areas. I started off in mental health, working with forensic clients, where I was a human rights advocate for them. So that was basically working with people who were going through the New South Wales Mental Health Review Tribunal and making sure that they had access to the highest attainable health, but that also that they weren't being exposed to any kind of discrimination and that their rights were being respected and fulfilled. I then transitioned into international development, which I did some fantastic work with Child Fund Australia. And Child Fund Australia is a part of a global alliance called the Child Fund Alliance, which has about 14 different offices around the world, which the head office is based in New York. They're the oldest children's rights organization. They're also the largest children's rights organization globally. And in my capacity in that role, I focus mainly on locally led development that really honored and protected the rights of children in the Southeast Asia and South Asia Pacific region. I also had the exciting role of being able to coordinate and really lead a lot of submissions into the United Nations, particularly the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which was an amazing opportunity to have. Probably my proudest achievement has been establishing Voices of Influence Australia, and we established that in March this year, and we have grown significantly over the last 8-9 months through this year with some really exciting projects and programs that we've been developing. Probably, again, one of our most exciting progressions that we've had is that we've just finalised our submission to the Australian government about Australia's engagement in Afghanistan, which again had a very large human rights focus on things, but also spoke about peace, conflict, and security, and countering violent extremism. If you are interested in that space and would love to have a read of that, I'm happy to share that around to you guys after this. But happy to, if you have any questions about it, or for you to share it. But yeah, very excited to be able to speak to you guys today. And I will pass over to one of my other teammates and allow them to introduce themselves.
I'm happy to jump in there. So hello, everyone. My name is Athena. I'm also a recent social work graduate. I think the breadth of my experience has been in healthcare, in mostly administrative roles. Currently, I work in primary care management, but I've been in the healthcare space for over 5 years, so I consider myself a little bit of a dinosaur in healthcare. After graduating from social work, I took on a part-time role at a domestic violence centre, so I do some work there. So my area of interest is around the health and welfare sector, and I do some spare part-time work here with Voices of Influence. And I just wanted to say that I'm really excited for today. I even went out and found myself a new Zoom background because I really wanted to, you know, bring some excitement to today's event. So I'm really excited to have a conversation with everyone today. I'll pass the floor over to another one of my colleagues.
Hi everyone, my name's Taylor. I'm the Legal and Political Affairs Director at Voices of Influence. I am also a recent graduate, a law graduate. I graduated last year from the University of Wollongong with a Bachelor of Laws and a Bachelor of Politics, Philosophy and Economics. I majored in economics. Since then, I've started at a large commercial law firm in Sydney, and I'm currently doing my graduate diploma of legal practice. I'll officially be a lawyer early next year. On the side, I am heavily involved with New South Wales Young Lawyers, which is the peak body for newly admitted solicitors and anyone that's been like a recent graduate or is new to the profession. So there I am the Vice Chair of the Communications, Entertainment and Technology Law Committee, and I'm also a General Delegate. So that has been lots of fun. My background in terms of the human rights space has been involved with a range of not-for-profits from, you know, high school to date. I've worked with YWCA, which is a feminist organisation, Share the Dignity, which is a period poverty charity, AIM, which is Indigenous mentoring, and yeah, just a range of things like that. Always remain pretty consistent and connected to those sectors, and I hope to be for a very long time. In my role in Voices of Influence, it's definitely expanding and will continue to develop, but it's sort of my role to coordinate legal action, and that's sort of my area. And yeah, as Alice mentioned, we have just wrapped a submission to a parliamentary inquiry regarding Australia's involvement in Afghanistan. I have a lot of experience with New South Wales Young Lawyers in making parliamentary and peak body submissions. It's something that even individuals can do. You know, you can get together with a couple of people and brainstorm and put forward your recommendations to Parliament or Senate committees and things like that. So, you know, definitely come and have a chat to me if you want to know more about that and how you can get involved as an individual. You definitely don't have to be a part of an organisation. You know, those inquiries are open to public consultation, and the government in particular is very eager to hear from young people on pressing issues, especially in the human rights space. So yeah, that is it from me.
I guess that leaves me. Hi, my name is Marie. I'm the Peace, Conflict and Security Chair at Voices of Influence. I'm also a recent social work graduate. I've done a fair bit of experience in the disability sector. So I've done a little bit of behaviour therapy, but I've mainly done working with disability in education systems. So I did a fair bit of work as an academic coach in the accessibility department, and I'm now working as a learning strategist to create more accessible learning plans for people with disability. I'm doing my master's in peace and conflict studies. So I'm currently doing a research project on counterterrorism strategies and looking at past strategies and their effectiveness. So I'm really quite interested in how social work sits in peace and conflict and what those multidisciplinary teams look like. And yeah, I'm very excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Fabulous. So yeah, those are a few of our colleagues on Voices of Influence Australia. I just realized I should have given you a bit more context about who we are as well. So we are a youth-led organisation, which our entire purpose is to move the masses from being passive individual consciences into being active collective voices for human rights. And the reason that we're youth-led and youth-focused is because we truly believe that there is a massive deficit of spaces for young people to take part in these democratic processes towards human rights. And that's something that we are really actively trying to change across Australia. So to give you a bit of idea of how we're going to run things today, I'm going to spend the first probably like 10 minutes just talking about what a human rights-based approach is, how social work applies to a human rights-based approach, and then also how that applies to the international stage and international human rights from that focus. And then from there, we will facilitate a discussion amongst us on the team. We really encourage you guys to be as active as you want to be in this space. Please use the chat box as much as you want. If you want to add any contributions to our discussions, if you want us to talk about a particular topic, please put it in the chat and we're very happy to start exploring those ideas. I'm just going to share my screen right now for you guys to see. Awesome. Okay, so as I said, we're looking at social work and the global human rights framework and that international stage. Just giving you a little bit of discussion about what to expect. So right now we're going to go over the social work principles and the human rights principles. Oops, sorry. Got a little bit over eager. So I just thought I'd give you guys a bit of context about what a human rights-based approach is. And just for the interest of time, I wanted to keep it really simple. So something that's quite fondly talked about in this space is the Human Rights Principles Acronym panel, which is rather ironic, seeing as this evening we're joining you here today for a panel. But basically panel stands for participation, accountability, non-discrimination, empowerment, and legality. So participation really looks at how people should be involved in the decisions that affect their rights. And I guess from a social work perspective, this really brings in that anti-oppressive and critical social work frameworks. And it really means I always go back to that saying, nothing about us without us. And so when you are in this advocacy space or those systemic levels of advocacy, make sure that the people that you're really trying to make change for are there at the table and are there allowing them to access as much agency and control over the changes that they need to realize their human rights. The next one is obviously accountability. And so that really explores how there should be monitoring of how people's rights are being affected, as well as remedies when things do go wrong. The next one is non-discrimination, and that really focuses on how all forms of discrimination must be prohibited, prevented, and eliminated. And people who face the biggest barriers to realizing their rights should always be prioritized. The next we look at empowerment, which is something that's very familiar to us in the social work space. It's something we probably use every single day in our language, but that really looks at how everyone should understand their rights and be fully supported to take part in developing policy and practices which affect their lives. And finally is the legality. So approaches that should be grounded in legal rights that are set out in domestic and international laws. I always also want to just talk about here how human rights is largely predominant, like made up by a bunch of discourses. And one of those is obviously that legal space, which is very important in terms of the protection, respect and fulfillment of everyone's rights. But there's also the discourse of activism, which is largely what we do with Voices of Influence Australia. And there's also the discourse of language of human rights as well, and really building that language of human rights into the dialogue of foreign policy, domestic policies and international law. Okay. So I just wanted to bring our attention as well to the something we're all probably very familiar of again in social work space, which is the AASW Code of Ethics and our practice standards. For those of us who are in field education too, this is something you're probably overly familiar with, as is probably referred to it a lot through your placement and also through the classes up until this point. For those of you in field education 1, this is going to be your guide and your gospel when really translating social work theory into practice. But the main thing that I want to talk about really within the Code of Ethics and our practice standards is what they talk about with social justice and human rights. So all these dot points are all in the Code of Ethics and Practice Standards, but I just thought I'd spend some time going over them now just to refamiliarize ourselves with them, and maybe spend some time, all of us, reflecting on how we put that into our own practice. So the first one obviously is looking at promoting policies, practices, and social conditions that uphold human rights and that seek to ensure access, equity, participation, and legal protection of all. It also looks at or sees that we advocate for change to social systems and structures that preserve inequalities and injustice. But it also looks that we oppose and work to eliminate all violations of human rights and affirms that civil, political rights will be accompanied by economic, social, and cultural rights. The last two things I just want to bring to attention is obviously the underlying principles of all the work that we do through social work, and that is the inherent dignity of humanity, human rights, and social justice. I'll say this now, I'll probably say it a couple of times through this panel, but I am a true believer that social workers are some of those frontline defenders of human rights globally and here in Australia, and we have a real responsibility to be the ones that realise the rights of all those that we work with. The last thing I just want to bring our attention to is also that in the profession of social work, it's our responsibility to subscribe to the principles and aspirations of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Other international conventions, which I will go through slightly after this slide, that have been derived from the Universal Declaration, as well as treaties to which Australia is a party to, and other human rights documents that we might refer to in this practice. I just also wanted to bring your attention to someone that I look up to tremendously, who is Zuma Sama, and she is fantastic, a true thought leader and trailblazer in this space. So she worked on the United Nations Secretary General's high-level panel on internal displacement. She also was a part of the United Nations Secretary General's high-level advisory board on mediation. She was a special envoy for the president of Afghanistan and state minister for human rights and international affairs. She was also the chairperson of the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission. She was the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Sudan. And Special Rapporteur is basically just fancy talk for they are seen as an expert and a thought leader in this space. She's also overseen the expansion of human rights education, the implementation of women's rights programs, and the monitoring of investigation of human rights abuses across Afghanistan, as well as other Middle Eastern countries. She was the first deputy chair and minister of women's affairs in the interim administration of Afghanistan, but she also founded Shahada organization, which operates 55 schools in Afghanistan, as well as 3 schools for Afghan refugees in Pakistan. And the reason I wanted to bring your attention to her is because she is also also a social worker and a human rights activist, and she is phenomenal in this space. Like I said, a true thought leader, a true trailblazer in the human rights space. So if you are interested in potentially following a career similar to this one or wanting to get involved in that international stage, I really recommend you to do a bit of a Google deep dive on her and all the accomplishments that she's had. Because I'm sure that you will just be in awe, in the same awe that I have of her after doing your own research. We actually had the opportunity a couple of weeks ago to attend the Geneva Human Rights Platform Conference, which she was the keynote speaker for. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to attend that, but Taylor, who is joined with us today, was able to attend that session and just said that she was phenomenal, and you could just see the leadership that she has in this space. So I wanted to bring your attention to, this is just a true example of how important social work is in this space, and how much impact and leadership that we can create with our profession. I just want to make some time now also to look at the Human Rights Conventions. And this is just those governing international documents which allow us to realize the rights of everyone and the rights that we are all born with. So the first one is the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. The next is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And the next is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The next is the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. There's the Convention of the Rights of the Child, the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of their Families, the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, and finally, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. A question that a lot of people ask when they look at all these documents is, well, how are we meant to realize all of these? And it's difficult. Across these documents, there are over 400 rights, which there is an obligation for states to respect, protect, and fulfill them for everyone that is in their protection. And so there's a massive movement from those in civil society, for non-for-profit organizations, individuals, politicians, decision makers that are really pushing for that agenda to happen. Something I just want to note also is, another question is, why is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, why is that separated? And this is just a technicality that you definitely don't need to know. It just is a historical story of after World War II, when these international documents were developed. There was a massive divide between Western countries and Eastern countries as to what human rights actually were. And where the Western countries had a massive push for civil and political rights, and Eastern countries had a much more focus on economic, social and cultural rights. I think from a social work perspective, we have to value all of these documents equally, particularly these two main ones of the civil, political and the economic, social and cultural rights. I think typically when you speak to other social workers that are driven to the human rights space, they tend to favor economic, social and cultural, but it's really important that we pay attention to all of them to make sure that the rights of everyone are realized. So that's it, just to give you a little bit of a context. I know that was a bit of an information dump, but I just wanted to give you a bit of information to kind of contextualize the conversations we will be having. And I would love to open the conversation now to the rest of my colleagues to really start exploring some interesting conversations around this space. So I think one of the first questions upon reflection, one of the questions was, has Australia ratified those UN conventions? Australia has ratified 7 out of those 9 conventions. It's really tricky though, because a lot of these documents aren't legally binding. And Australia, again, this is a very technical thing you don't need to know, but it is a dualist state, which means that international law, particularly human rights law, isn't automatically legally binding to Australia. So it's about how those international documents get translated into domestic law. In Australia, it's a really tricky one because we currently don't have a Bill of Rights, and so the fight for those of us that are fighting for the realization of rights in Australia, it's a really tricky one to navigate, but we can discuss that as a group through today. Another question we just had was, can you tell us any of Zuma Sama's story? Why did she get into this work? Again, this is probably something that we won't have time for tonight, but I will happily after this panel send you some links of her story, because again, it's very inspiring. And if for those of you that do want to get in this space and follow those footsteps, definitely a story to always keep in the back of your mind. But thank you for your questions. I appreciate it. The first question I want to kind of open to the floor and my colleagues here is, talking about human rights can sometimes be so consuming, as it's such a big topic. We've just seen all the current conventions that we need to follow. And like I said, there's over 400 rights within those documents. So I think a question that we need to really understand is, what are the most critical human rights issues we must challenge to face the future effectively? And I recognize that it's a very loaded question, but I have full faith that between all of us, we'll be able to have some kind of answer from it. But please, would any of my colleagues like to jump in and start the conversation?
Yeah, so I'll jump in. I think that when we're trying to conceptualize sort of what's the most critical human issues, my mind first goes to vulnerable groups and marginalized communities. I think that at its core, as Alice just discussed with the human rights-based approach, a human rights-based approach means that all forms of discrimination in the realization of these rights need to be prohibited, prevented, and eliminated. And often that, by virtue of that, you need to be prioritizing people in the most marginalized or vulnerable situations who face the biggest barriers to realizing their rights. And that's why certain governments are particularly reactive with their public inquiries. For instance, the situation unfolding in Afghanistan, albeit that is, a 20-year military engagement that's sort of toppling over at the moment. But it's, that focus on marginalized groups. I think in terms of critical human issues, that sort of leads into divisiveness as a society. These, I'm sure Marie could speak at length to the issues that borders can create in terms of the realization of rights, and how when people are from different states or different countries or the global north or the global south, a lot of people feel disconnected to them, and it's hard to then advocate for international law and sort of be advocates in the broader scheme of things, and just it's for humanity as a whole, because you're told that there are so many things separating you from those people. There's so many barriers at airports and geographical distance, and then you sort of become disconnected to those vulnerable people, but it's those people that need you the most, no matter where you are. So I think that is a critical human issue. I think another thing which sort of goes back to the human rights-based approach is that it only makes sense to talk of a right if there is a corresponding obligation. So someone who has a right needs to be able to assert this right against another person who holds a duty mirroring that right. So often, obviously, that's governments. They're the duty bearers, the public authorities. And it's in many countries, especially the more developed ones, it's, acknowledge the governments need to respect, protect and fulfill every right. And we as human beings and as rights holders need to have access to public authorities, like courts and police and political representatives, and at the local and national levels. And, we're very fortunate in countries like Australia where there's due process, and we have a lot of, formal equality. We've got some that doesn't always translate into substantive practical realities for people, but we do have, the Racial Discrimination Act, the Sex Discrimination Act, and things like that. So we have, we all vote. We live in a democratic society, and that's our access, and that's our government is showing us that they're meeting those obligations by providing us with those things. But obviously, some people in different parts of the world, in marginalized groups, don't have that kind of access, and that is a critical human issue for everybody, because I think that, the sentiments even now with the COVID-19 pandemic is that, you're not safe until everyone is safe. So I think that same mentality should be adopted with human rights, because ultimately, who is free if everyone isn't? So I think that's just, that just comes back to humanity as a whole. But yeah, that would be my long-winded answer to that question.
Just to go off that, Taylor, I love what you said about access, and I like to more speak about what I know of, and in the healthcare space. So you described a lot of, human rights issues there, and there are definitely a lot of gross human rights violations in the healthcare space when you think about no access to abortion for women, practitioners assaulting patients, that sort of stuff. But when you spoke about access, that was what I wanted to kind of hone in on, that a lot of these human rights issues are under the surface. And from, I wanted to kind of translate all of this to something that was a bit more tangible for the audience, because I recognize that you're all going to be social work practitioners and you're not going to be out there, doing all this international stuff. A lot of you are going to go into aged care, healthcare, disability care, that sort of space. When we talk about access and the under the surface sort of issues, the World Health Organization, so they describe the right to health as the right to the highest attainable standard of health. And that's the key word there. It's not just the right to health, it's the right to the highest attainable standard. And I think then you have to look at the core components of what that is. And that's stuff like availability, accessibility, acceptability, the quality of healthcare that you're getting. Is it safe? Is it effective? Is the system efficient? Is it not regressing? Are we not going backwards? So those sorts of issues are under the surface, but still very, very important. And so in an Australian context, when you think about what are some, to answer the question, what is some of the most critical human rights issues that we have to challenge to face the future effectively. Look at things like the system, Australia's healthcare system. We've got a fantastic system and, you know, lots and lots of funding, but is it really that efficient? There's so much gaps in healthcare. There's so many people falling in the cracks in Australia. But then when you look at overseas, they're missing the most fundamental parts, which is just availability. There's not enough resources to go around. So while you do have those really out there issues that make it onto the media and whatnot, kind of dig a little bit deeper below the surface and look at some of the systemic issues. So I think in order to face the future effectively, we have to look at the system and sort of is the system the barrier, essentially, not individuals or communities? Is it the system that's, you know, impeding progress? Yeah.
I think that such a big question can be taken from like many different directions in being answered. But I think for me, something that really stands out is accountability. So from an international perspective, a lot of the time, human rights violations that are occurring will be out of the control of social workers. And I think that what's really important is accountability. So if we look at, you know, asylum seekers and Australia's laws around it, and Alice already mentioned some of the challenges that arise by international law and Australia, how we are as a state, I think accountability is something that is very critical, that should be acknowledged. So when, you know, the arrival of asylum seekers, are our current policies in Australia that we're working with going to create further human rights violations? So yes, you know, there's civil wars happening. There's a lot of things that are happening, you know, outside the realm of our power and control to kind of address. And the goal would be to address the initial human rights violations. But something to also consider is then, okay, well, what are the experiences when asylum seekers are coming to Australia? Can guarantee that a lot of the time there's numerous human rights violations. Australia tends to get slammed from a lot of directions because our standard of how we're treating people coming to Australia is very shocking. So I think something to also look at is, you know, these human rights violations aren't always, you know, the primary thing being impacted. A lot of the time it's secondary. And so I think putting yourself, okay, as a social worker, sometimes we focus on that initial human rights violation, you know, access to safety and okay, you know, access to safety might be an issue. So we've, you know, got asylum seekers, we've got migration, but then what does that look like in Australia? How can we help to change the policies to ensure we're not further discriminating and further oppressing these communities? So I think a future that it's effective, I think we really need to start with accountability and look at how we are currently still oppressing so many communities through our policies, that a lot of the times as social workers, you have to follow the policies that are set currently.
Such fantastic points. And I just want to bring to attention, thank you, Marie, for bringing up Australia's approach to asylum seekers. There's a comment here in the chat that says, the UN Convention for the Rights of Refugees is totally ignored by the Australian government, even though Australia is a party to it. It doesn't seem like there is any real accountability when rights are not upheld for all UN conventions. Such a fantastic point. And this is a really tricky space within human rights, particularly in the Australian context. One of the projects we're working on as an organisation is to create a campaign looking at unaccompanied minors seeking asylum here in Australia, and really focus on the Convention of the Rights of the Child and the abuses that Australia is currently inflicting onto children when we look at our asylum and immigration policies. And that, a little bit more context for us, we're looking at what it would look like to have an independent body to oversee that and really make sure that the rights of children are absolutely respected, protected and fulfilled. And I think particularly part of that accountability is having these independent bodies to oversee that as well. I think just adding to what's just been discussed today and just previously what I spoke about before about in Australia, and I'm reading in the comments now, and there's a couple of comments about how Australia seems to be party to these conventions, but there's no accountability to it. And I just want to dip in to say that, yes, Australia is a party to 7 out of these 9 main conventions. But because Australia is a dualist state, it doesn't mean that international law integrates directly into our practice. There needs to be domestic policy, domestic legislation here. And Taylor kind of spoke about that, about how, like our gender discrimination acts and other policies such in that. I think probably speaking about accountability, for me, one of the biggest challenges looking at human rights in the Australian context is that there needs to be a Bill of Rights. There needs to be, that goes across all states. There are a few states in Australia, Queensland's one of them, South Australia, that have their own state Bill of Human Rights, which is a great start, a really fantastic start. But unless we have a really overarching governing document and policy and legislation that really realizes rights here in Australia, it's really tricky and really difficult to advocate for our government to realize the rights of the people that are under its care in Australia. So for me, that's, from my opinion, that's one of the biggest difficulties that we face in terms of how can we have an effective future for human rights. But it is such a complex question. It's a very loaded question, and I think my colleagues were able to tackle that in a really really considerate way. And thank you for all of you that had made your own contributions in the chat as well. I can see that this is already a question that you guys have been grappling with, and it's a really important question to keep in your mind as you delve into this space as well. I think probably another question that's on my mind, just from the conversations emerging as well, is that we've spoken about what's needed for an effective future in Australia and internationally, when really realizing and protecting the human rights and human dignity that we are all born with and are born with that right. But the next question would then be, well, what's next for the human rights movement? How can we raise the voices of smaller organizations and marginalized communities who are already making a big impact in this space? How can we really promote the change of human rights? And I think that's another loaded question, but I'd love to pass it over to one of my colleagues to start the conversation.
I'd love to break it down a bit first with, obviously, the nature of political regimes across many different countries, as well as sort of like cultural and institutional factors, are going to significantly influence the implementation of human rights, and whether that be domestically or internationally, that is always going to sort of steer the narrative in some way. Like, for instance, in Australia, we were colonised, the First Nations people were colonised, and the curriculums and the legislation have colonial effect, and they've been built and designed to serve that group of people to the detriment of another, to the serious detriment is a very generous word, to the absolute gross exploitation of the other. And so that will, so long as the same system exists, will perpetuate all kinds of injustices. So that is a huge sort of caveat on the human rights movement, that specific example, obviously, here in Australia and overseas. So to the same tune, the specific application of that human rights-based approach is also going to depend on the different stakeholders. So who the rights holders are, who the duty bearers are, and the supporting actors. So, organisations like Voices of Influence Australia, like the UN, other donors, like they all play a part. So, from a bird's eye view, that's the human rights movement. That's the context in which it lives, right? So with the question of how can we raise the voice of smaller organisations and communities who are already making a big impact, I think that just unwavering support in all of its forms is always going to help the direction of the human rights movement in a positive way, obviously. There is, in the age of technology, there are so many ways that you can show support without leaving your room. And it's truly incredible. And it's the reason that certain movements and certain things have sort of made it past the gate, just that mobilization of young people through social media. And, even like back with the suffragette movement, for instance, they had posters and door knocking, and it took them so much effort to mobilize the masses and to organize secret meetings and to sort of attend those protests, to get the word out. That was a mission in itself. And here we have like Facebook events that can have thousands of people. There is not a big protest on climate justice or gender equality that goes by that I don't see within a few hours of it being created. And that's of no effort of my own, really. It's just something that pops up in front of me. So I think that showing your support online and everywhere else, obviously your physical presence is wonderful if that's something that you feel safe to contribute to, attending a protest or a rally. But it's, so easy to support things online by sharing content on your social media, even without making your own commentary. It does so much. And you might think that it doesn't, but it really does, because it also influences other people. I feel like when you share something to your story, you might, a few people might see it, and out of those few people, maybe one person that was, sort of like undecided on whether they should attend the climate strike is now attending because they were like, oh, you know what, this is really so many people post about such a big issue. I didn't realize the gravity of it until right now. So I think that it has such a domino effect, so much more than people realize. So I think that is one way that we can support the human rights movement at a smaller grassroots level.
I completely agree with you, Taylor. So literally the first thing I wrote there for social workers in direct practice is to share local and global initiatives with your team, who will then share it with, other people they know in the industry. And I think a lot of us who work in the not-for-profit sector see those mass emails of everyone sharing events and, programs that are coming up and whatnot. But I think it always tends to fall on our shoulders. So I'm going to start a little bit of a riot here and suggest a partnership with the devil, the private sector. I work in both not-for-profit and for-profit. And the for-profit private sector is also, they have caused a lot of these human rights issues, but also those that work in the private sector are a little bit sheltered to what's really going on out there. And I think trying to engage people in the private sector could be very useful. Even something as small as I've shared community activities and whatnot with those in a private company that I work with, and everyone's like, oh my God, that's so cool. And I was like, wow, they have hearts. But as well as sharing things with them and trying to engage them, also holding them accountable. And I think a lot of consumers are starting to do that now with large companies. They're starting to out what they're doing, and they're starting to make noise about everything. So I would say next would be to try and, partner up with the devil.
I think to go off what Taylor and Athena have mentioned, advocacy has become very trendy. So you can see, in a lot of the recent movements, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, it became quite trendy to get involved and to advocate. And it never used to be like that. There was a stage where it was all just the lefties or the greenies that were doing the advocacy, whereas now it's become trendy for everyone to get involved. And I think that just shows how the future of human rights movements are very youth-led, because it is a lot of the young adults and youth that do get involved in the advocacy. But I think also for what's next for human rights within a social work arena is that critical lens. So you see a lot of now, it's not just that, okay, there's been a human rights violation and how can we address the impact and the trauma that's happened for the individual, but it's like, okay, well, why has that human rights violation happened? What's happening for the other to have caused that scenario, rather than just focusing on the one side? And it's like, okay, it's happened, so let's kind of address it, which a lot of social work does that. It's looking at, well, what, without justifying it, looking at, okay, what's caused that, and how can we also work with the other side to kind of work out how we can avoid this from happening. What's maybe their interest base that aren't being met that has caused it to happen? And you see that a lot of the time overseas in a lot of areas where it's actually a focus shift needs to happen. And I think the future of human rights movements is getting a more well-rounded explanation using our critical lens and really utilizing the why.
Such good points. And I just want to pick up on a few things you guys are saying. Taylor, I love your approach in saying how you can have a reactive approach to human rights movement, and also a responsive approach, and how we can do things in the immediate moment, but also there's a longevity and sustainability of that human rights movement as well, and how we can all get involved in that space. Athena, I love what you were saying about partnering with the devil. I think that's I've never heard anyone describe it that way, but I think that's I love the way you described it. But I think an even bigger message that comes through from that is really like developing that constructive dialogue around these, that cross-sectorial like view of things, but also it could be just having that constructive dialogue with people that have opposing views from you as well. I know previously we've spoken about on panels, there's an article that's circulating around about rather than calling people out, to call people in. And I think we can really translate that into that divide between the not-for-profit and private sectors as well, because and really to have a sustainable direction towards the promotion and protection of human rights, we can't have these silos. We need to have a much more collaborative effort. And so by inviting the devil in, and so Athena just said, I think is such an important conversation to really start fleshing out. And Marie, I love what you were saying about like how young people are the ones that are really pushing for this as well. I think young people are really the force behind the human rights movement. I think not a lot of our decision makers have acknowledged that. And the reason that I say that I think young people are one of the biggest forces behind the human rights movement isn't just because we as an organization are youth-led, but I think when we're looking at sustainability and the sustainability of the human rights movement, we need to create ownership in generations. And that's not just in older generations and our decision makers, it's fostering ownership in people that are, ages like 14 to 15 into, like graduating high school into university and then translating into that professional world. We need to foster that ownership of how we can protect and promote human rights. And young people are the ones that are doing that. I also really like Marie, and I think it taps into having that constructive dialogue as well, and having that critical lens and that natural curiosity of being like, it's all good and well to condemn countries and nations and states for human rights violations. But the other conversation is that human rights are costly, they're expensive, and a massive critique of human rights is, are they actually attainable for developing nations? These standards that we've set, when they don't have the funding there to have proper education, to have proper judicial systems, to have proper law and justice. And so in that case, are they set up to fail when we have these standards there? And so that the question should be, what more can the international community be doing to help support them realize the rights of the people that they have the protection of? It's such a complicated question. It's such a complex area to talk about, but I think like we're able to kind of at least summarize the conversations that are emerging and the discourse that is emerging in that space. I'd love to kind of move the conversation on to one last question, which is, I guess, we've spoken about what we need for an effective future. We've spoken about what's next for the human rights movement. I guess the next question in my mind is, how can we as frontline defenders influence decision makers to protect, respect, and fulfill international human rights obligations? And I would happy for one of you to take off, otherwise I'll probably go on a tangent.
I think this is tricky because when we look at in the past, there's been numerous times when frontline defenders have made recommendations that get completely ignored, and then we've seen the repercussions later. It's happened way too many times. But I think this links back to what you just mentioned, Alice, about the fact that human rights sometimes can be a little complicated, because I guess it's fantastic to have that framework and to hold human rights at the center of what you do in practice. Don't get me wrong, I'm definitely all for that. However, when we're looking at international human rights obligations, it can sometimes be tricky, because when we take on a human rights lens, it sometimes gives off the win-lose scenario, where it's like, okay, well, we're going to rectify and we're going to focus on the human rights violation that has occurred. And in that instance, in a happy ending, it's like, well, then that's the win. But if we focus on the why on it has occurred, the other is then in a lose. And when you have a win-lose, it kind of just sets up a natural pathway for more human rights violations. So I think sometimes as social workers, a human rights lens is always so essential, but we really need to think about how that applies to practice. Sometimes theories are fantastic, but the way we then transfer it into practice can be so different to what it would look like in a textbook. I mean, if we look at it, an international arena, and if we look at conflict resolution and peace within an international setting, a lot of the time it's an interest-based focus rather than a human rights-based focus. And that's because, yes, we need to acknowledge that human rights are so essential, and we need to make sure that, you know, human rights violations aren't happening. But if we don't give any focus to the other side and the interests that they want and the needs that aren't being met, if we just look at, you know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a lot of the time that's a common cause for then human rights violations to occur. So I think as frontline defenders, we need to be really, really mindful of, okay, what does this human rights perspective look like in practice? Do I need to take a step back and kind of think about, okay, human rights, yes, we need to promote it, but is there negative consequences to what that might look like, and how can we avoid that? Again, critical thinking caps are so important in this instance, because sometimes we create things in theory and then in practice they might not work. So I think really being critical about it.
I just wanted to say, I love that so much, Marie. I love how, you know, as social workers, we can do it with the individual. We don't think, well, we have a perpetrator and victim, however you say it, but we never look at the perpetrator and say they're a bad person, they're horrible, they're disgusting. We always come from, well, what happened to them? Is this a trauma response? That sort of thing. So if we can do it with the individual, why can't we do it with these two sides of whatever the human rights issue as well? This is probably the first time I've seen it from that perspective. So I just wanted to say that I absolutely love that.
I think from a legal perspective or a human rights lawyer perspective, as I do not have frontline defender experience, I do not have a background in social work, so I want to make that very clear. That's definitely the other incredible women on this panel have that experience. In my experience in the legal field, I think that a community-centric approach is extremely important for the fulfillment of international human rights obligations, and because all of that starts obviously at a community level and at a domestic level if the vulnerable groups are there. So I think that it's something that human rights lawyers do particularly well, not so much corporate lawyers or anything like that, is that they combine their legal representation with community empowerment and community organising. And that is sort of the turning point for the fulfilment of these rights, so that they can create political spaces for disenfranchised populations to reclaim their rights. Because the most important thing is that rights holders should be involved at every stage of the analytical work. So as Marie says, you know, critical thinking caps are very important. That is something that you need to have on at all times, and those people need to be the center of the narrative and should be involved at every stage, despite the fact that they may be vulnerable and that you're there to amplify their voice, or you're there to legally represent them, or you're there to guide them as a social worker. It's their story and it's their vulnerability. So in the legal sense, this expands that traditional legal advocacy paradigm beyond, you know, being represented in court to include this broad-based organising that gives communities the opportunity to learn their rights and assert themselves as rights holders. And I think that that can apply across the board and can sort of intersect in social work as well. So, yeah.
I want to draw upon what you just said, Taylor, because so my background's in social work and I'm now doing international law, and conversations I've had privately with Taylor is that my observations within the legal space and conversations I've had with judges and lawyers is that there's a massive resistance, I find, from lawyers to be engaging with this human rights dialogue. I spoke at the beginning of this panel about the different discourses of human rights, and there's obviously going to be a legal component of that discourse. There's the activism, there's the language, but that's been a really interesting observation of me stepping into this legal space space is that I had this perhaps slight naivety expectation of like, oh, this is where people are going to really be engaging this conversation, these frameworks, and this is where really the exciting frontline stuff's going to happen. And I like my experience in that law space so far, I've become quite disillusioned that isn't that same enthusiasm about it. And conversations that I've had with judges that are massive advocates for the Convention of the Rights of the Child, for Convention against eliminating discrimination against women, they are the first to say that in the legal space, there's massive resistance and barriers in place to adopt that conversation and adopt that language. And we spoke in the previous question about these silos of human rights and how it's very disjointed that we have the activism, the legal, the front work, and similarly to the conversation we said how the private and non-for-profit sector need to work collaboratively. I feel like there needs to be more of a flowing conversation and flowing relationship between the law and social work. And I know, Taylor, we've privately had conversations about that, but I don't know if you have anything else you want to add to that conversation today.
No, Alice makes a very good point. And I remember the first time she raised this with me, she's like, you may disagree. And I'm like, I don't disagree at all. So it's the resistance is very real. And I think that sort of drawing on what Athena was saying earlier about holding big corporate accountable, the way that you would when you shop consciously, socially conscious and environmentally conscious about your purchases and where your money's going, and you know the values that these companies may or may not uphold, and whether you're willing to put sort of line their pockets. That same sort of accountability should be held to all, like the entire legal profession, in my opinion. I think that this resistance is because a lot of people, and I think you'll find that people even not in any other field, when they're not directly involved in that service to others, or in this way, in a human rights based way, they think that the conversation sort of doesn't really include them, and they don't really need to participate, and it's not sort of their thing to familiarize themselves with, and it starts there. And I mean, it's a lot more nuanced than that. I think that, you know, you're sort of taught throughout your studies in law, that is that everything's very formal and applies to rules, and there's law, and then there's application, and then there's your conclusion. And it's just that sort of like rigid structure, and that rigid mentality stays with people into their practice and into so many other areas of law. And the saddest part is that obviously it doesn't matter what kind of law you're practicing or what job you're in, you are a human being and you live in a community. And that community has disadvantaged people a part of it. That community has marginalized people. And everything that you say and do directly affects other people, so long as you share the earth with other people. So no one is sort of free to escape the conversation of human rights, in my opinion. I think that, you know, you should be at any job, you should be coming to work as your most conscious and respectful self, and, you know, work as hard as you can to be trauma informed, because at the end of the day, we work with people, and human rights is about people. So
fantastic points. I just wanted to open that conversation again. And I think as an organization, Voices of Influence, we're really lucky that we have a very multidisciplinary team. We have a few social workers here in the team. We've got Taylor with the law profession. We have journalists. We have those in social policy. We have, and from that, the thing that we all really connect on is this absolute calling for the promotion and protection of human rights. But we're able to draw from each other's knowledges and experience in the sector. And I think that the thing I really want to bring home here is that human rights are everyone's responsibility, regardless of what profession that you're in. And as social workers, I think as those frontline defenders, and in my experience as a community that's very strong in defending the space, we have also a duty to draw people into that conversation as well. So many interesting points, and I think we could sit here and talk about it for another 20 minutes, but just in the interest of time, I think it's time that we go into breakout rooms, and so we allow those who are attending the seminar today to ask some individual questions of us. So we're going to be doing 2 breakout rooms, both will be 20 minutes, one after the other. There will be 3 breakout rooms that you can choose from. The first breakout room will be with myself and Taylor, and we will be talking about international human rights, how that translates to Australia, how we can really fulfill human rights, both in the national space and international space. The second breakout room will be with Marie, and Marie will be talking with the lens of peace, conflict, and security, and the issues of human rights related to that, and is happy to answer any questions you might have about peace and conflict and the role of social work in that space as well. And finally, we have the lovely Athena, who will be doing the third breakout room, and she will be talking about public health, health promotion, and the right to life and the right to health, and how that is translated into Australia and the international space as well. So I know for those of you who put questions in the chat, I've noted them, and we'll make time for them after we rejoin from the breakout rooms to discuss those things. But I think it's best we go into the breakout rooms. Frankie, are we able to facilitate that? Hello. All right, guys. So I hope you found those breakout rooms helpful. We will spend the next 15 minutes of our session today really talking about the conversations that emerged from these breakout rooms. I probably, if your breakout rooms were any similar to Taylor and my ones, there was probably a lot that was discussed. So we'll try to streamline it as much as we can. Perhaps I'll start, Taylor and I can start by talking about our one. So our breakout room was international human rights. And there was a lot of interest in this, a lot of questions, mainly about accountability, which, as we saw previously in the human rights framework, is a massive compartment of how we can realize, promote, and protect human rights. We also looked at state responsibility. We looked at how can we enforce human rights from a legal perspective and a community perspective. And we looked at what are the consequences of not meeting human rights obligations as well from an international law perspective. It was a really interesting because and a lot of the questions that were brought up in the breakout room were questions I really resonated with, deeply with when I was just on that teetering point of transitioning from social work into international law. So they're big questions and things that there's hundreds of papers and articles discussing this with a lot of critique. But to give a little bit of a summary, we basically spoke about the issue of state sovereignty and how, and which is basically lawyer talk where it's none of your business, like you take care of your garden, I'll look after mine, and how that is a common law in international law. And so how can Australia enforce human rights in other countries, and also how can other countries enforce human rights in Australia as well? We spoke about a couple of different mechanisms like the Universal Periodic Review and other instruments in place to keep enforce things, but there is a very complicated topic and something that would definitely be prudent to have a dedicated panel to talk about that particular issue. But Taylor, do you have anything you want to add to what we discussed in our groups?
I think that you summarized it very well. I think that a very important discussion that we had towards the end of both was the upcoming federal election, and that sort of being your most accessible and direct ground work in terms of advancing international law and fulfilling human rights at an international scale, because the government that you elect is going to be responsible for that for the coming years. So I definitely encourage everybody, I know we all do, to keep your critical thinking hats on, as Marie would say, and keep it on all the way to the polls and make a very informed choice when you exercise your right to vote.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself. Awesome. Marie, do we want to pass over to you? Because we're talking about peace and conflict issues and human rights. So we'd love to hear the kind of conversations that emerged from your breakout room.
Yeah, so I might focus on the first breakout room that I had. The second one, I think I was just waffling on into a lot of different directions. But in the first one, we had quite a big chat on war on drugs and war on terror. So we had a bit of a question about war on drugs and what my perspective was on it. And I think between war on drugs and war on terror, the really important thing to look at is that they're both looking at different things, but the approach that's being taken to address them. Without getting too much into my personal perspective, I just want to we spoke about how when we go in with a very military-led top-down approach, we kind of go against a lot of social work, and it's about that building rapport within communities and finding out the needs in an interest-based perspective rather than too much of a human rights-based perspective. So we had a big chat about the US, we had a chat about the Philippines. There's a big war on drugs issue in the Philippines at the moment. And we spoke about how when we're looking at human rights, it's also really important to think about within the realm of war on drugs, as an example, to be thinking about different perspectives. So the perspective of the people that are facilitating, I guess you could say, war on drugs, what has led to that? So rather than focusing on this is bad and we need to stop this, focusing on, okay, what has led to that within the country? If we don't focus on that initial perspective and that driver and those antecedents, then we're kind of just doing a bit of a band-aid. So we focused on then what does that then look like for governments, and what's governments' roles? What does that look like for communities that are being impacted, but also communities that are just watching? And how, as the social worker, you're kind of just situated in the middle and kind of juggling all of these different perspectives that tend to be super different, and how going overseas can then be quite challenging because you've got people coming from completely different avenues, and having to juggle that as the social worker is quite the challenge. But we then kind of evolved into advocacy and the role of advocacy and what that might look like, which stemmed on from war on drugs, people that are very for it and people that are very against it. So we started to talk about advocacy for human rights and how it can be super challenging when people are very against you. So we had a little conversation about how sometimes joining advocacy organizations, you can let your voice be heard and you're joining those groups with very like-minded people, rather than dinner time conversations are fantastic because you do need to, if you can't have those conversations at the dinner table, how are you going to have the conversations in the mass? But sometimes knowing when to give up the fight and surround yourself by like-minded people, where there was a little promotion to get involved with Voices of Influence.
I was just about to put a cheeky plug in there too, if you hadn't already. But yeah, absolutely. If any of you are very much interested in getting into the space of community activism and advocacy for human rights, us as a team at Voices of Influence Australia are always looking for ways to expand, always looking for ways to encourage the masses and to bring them on board with the work that we're doing with human rights. And there are lots of really exciting programs and projects that we're developing between now and over the next year as well. So if you're interested in human rights and want to get that experience in that space, please reach out to us. Taylor's just put all our emails in the chat, so by all means we'd be happy to have a conversation with you. Athena, you're the last breakout room. I'd love to hear the kind of conversations that came out from your breakout room.
Yeah, so we had, so obviously health promotion was the topic, and we were talking about the topic of vaccines. And I know prior to actually doing this panel, I kind of raised it with everyone and said, is this going to be a bit too much? Should we have this conversation at all? And I think that as social workers, we need to actually have these conversations, and we need to lean into them, and we can't shy away from them, because we're going to be dealing with a lot of consumers who are going to be experiencing situations around this. We didn't have, there is never one straight answer, but we all kind of encouraged each other to look at the different reasons for and against, and consider why someone would be for and why someone would be against without judgment. I learned a lot about, culture. We were talking about having discussions about fear and, protecting the community, protecting everyone as a whole, doing it on behalf of people who can't get it for whatever reason. So it was a fantastic conversation. A lot happened, a lot of voices in there, but ultimately I'm glad that everyone could have that very respectful communication with each other about it, which I think is going to be very important for their practice, because there is no doubt that this is going to pop up in their practice. I'm pretty sure it's already happened in practice already, but it's going to happen over the next few weeks and months. Yeah.
Such a good point. And I think that's something that's really popped up a few times through our panel this evening, is about having those skills to be able to have that constructive dialogue, and how important that is for the human rights movement as well. I'll refer again to the article that's been circulated around a few times, which is about, rather than calling out, why don't we call in? And that it's a very difficult balance to make. I will be the first to say I have not mastered it. It's a very difficult skill to have, to be able to really engage in those constructive dialogues without getting frustrated, without getting angry, but so crucial in terms of the promotion and protection and fulfillment of human rights in Australia as well as internationally. Fantastic conversations that just came out of that breakout rooms, and I wish I could have participated in the Marie and Athena. Sounds like some fantastic conversations came out of that, and I wish I could have been a part of that to listen to those conversations evolve. But I guess just in the final 5 minutes that we have, one last question I have for all of us here, and again, it might be a bit loaded, a bit hard to summarize, but if there was one takeaway message that you wanted everyone on this panel to be able to go home and just, or if that was one thing that resonated with them, what would that be from tonight's evening?
I would say that the human rights movement starts with you. That is, I feel like, the takeaway, the sort of motif of all of these really important things that we're discussing, and all of these different multidisciplinary areas that intersect in order to fulfill human rights on an international or on a domestic level. So I would say that it starts with you, and that everything that you do contributes to furthering that movement, whether it's like one Instagram story is doing something, you attending a protest is doing something, you even just understanding how a treaty works is doing something, because then you take that knowledge with you when you're making decisions and when you're being, an active political participant in society.
For me, I'm still mind blown by Marie's comment about looking at both sides of one issue. And I think this is what I love about this organisation, or just participating in panels, or, having chats to other people in the industry, is that you're always learning something new. And I resonate with that completely. And I hope other people did as well. So, yeah.
I think that sometimes when we talk about human rights, we talk about the really big human rights violations that are happening, and we focus on those big, huge issues that feel so distant from us. I think my takeaway to really kind of reiterate is that human rights is the small stuff too. So it can literally be helping, addressing dignity when, if we look at period poverty, giving someone a pad that can't afford it. That's helping. That's a focus on human rights. There's so many little things that we can do in our day-to-day lives that we don't really do, because when we talk about human rights, we talk about, we think about civil wars and we think about these really big issues that are happening. But I think look at our backyards and think about things that we can do. As Taylor mentioned, Share the Dignity is all about period poverty. Get involved in that. Help people in the ways that you can, rather than pushing it away because it's so far.
Such good points. And I just like bringing up what you just said, Marie, about it being the small things. I think in Australia in particular, sometimes one of the barriers I've observed in terms of this movement of human rights is that sometimes there's a disconnect between the Australian public and the promotion and pursuit of human rights. And perhaps one of those is that it feels very foreign and alien to us when we think about human rights as these massive global catastrophes, whether it's peace and conflict, whether it's a natural disaster, and the human rights related to that. I think when we talk about it at the top level, which is absolutely a necessary conversation, but it's equally important to have conversations about that grassroots level of things with human rights. That is what really reaffirms and reasserts the connection between human rights and almost humanizing human rights, which sounds like such a weird concept or weird sentence, but it's something that is really imperative if we want this movement to really grow. I think, speaking personally, if there was one takeaway that I would love the rest of the students on this panel to take away, is that kind of stemming on from what Taylor just said, human rights starts with you, and what Marie was just saying as well, again, starts with you at the bottom level, even if it's contributing to organizations like Share the Dignity, whether it's random acts of kindness, but that really promote human dignity as well. But I think as practitioners, it's really important if human rights is going to be one of the bedrocks of our professional framework and one of the bedrocks of our calling, to really look at it from that critical lens and see it as an interdisciplinary perspective as well. Those of us who joined the breakout room with Taylor and I, and we spoke about previously as well, is that the discourses of human rights, whether the legality of it, whether the activism side of things, whether the language of the discourse, we can't operate in silos. These three discourses really need to interconnect. So as social workers, if you are interested in this international human rights space, just for this, learning for learning's sake, learn about the human rights conventions, learn about a few, like even just the principles of international law, learn about what obligations Australia has in ratifying these human rights conventions. How, as practitioners, can we advocate that Australia do that properly? How can we promote, how can we push for decision makers to prioritize human rights? It's such a complicated conversation to have, but I have so much hope for human rights. I really believe in it. I think all of us as an organization believe in the power of human rights and the power of human dignity. And as social workers, that is something that I think all of us should have a calling to as well. That wraps up our panel for tonight. I really hope that you found it valuable. I'm thrilled to have had the conversations that we had this evening. Thank you for all your contributions. Lots of things that I'm sure all of us will have a lot to reflect on leaving the panel tonight. But if you do wish to either get involved with Voices of Influence, or you just want to reach out to us for a conversation, to run something by us, to learn more, Taylor put our contacts in the chat. We will send through our contacts as well. But please reach out to us, because we love having conversations like this to continue. But thank you for your time, and I'm sure you will all make fantastic human rights defenders.
Thank you so much. It was amazing. Amazing.
I'm so pleased.